What if the loudest truth in the room was never spoken, because someone was paid to make sure it stayed buried? Let that sit for a second. For years, the public narrative around Meghan has felt airtight, polished, carefully managed. Every detail curated, every silence explained away as dignity, distance, or taking the high road. But what if that silence wasn't a choice at all? What if it was a transaction? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Tonight, everything changes. Because three people who were never supposed to speak at the same time have now done exactly that. A father who refused to stay quiet. A sister who paid the price for telling her version of the truth. And a mother who, by her own admission, says she stayed silent for years because she was paid to. Ask yourself this. If the story we were told was solid, why would silence need to be bought? This isn't about tabloid noise or recycled family drama. This is about timing, precision, and pressure. Because these voices aren't emerging randomly. They're surfacing together. And that alone should make you uncomfortable. Doria Ragland, the one figure often described as calm, composed, and above the chaos, is now at the center of the most unsettling claim of all. That her silence wasn't just emotional distance. It was contractual. That there were things she allegedly knew about family history, early relationships, and moments that never made it into the public version of events. And that staying quiet came with terms. Think about that. A mother signing away her voice. Why now? Why after years of restraint does the story suddenly crack open? What changed behind the scenes that made silence no longer worth the cost? And here's where it gets more disturbing. According to those close to the situation, this wasn't just about protecting feelings. It was about protecting a narrative. About making sure certain timelines stayed clean. Certain names stayed out of reach. Certain questions were never asked too loudly. Meanwhile, on the outside, Thomas Markle was being painted as reckless for speaking. Samantha Markle as bitter for refusing to stop. But what if the real anomaly wasn't the ones talking, but the one who never did? Let me ask you something directly. If you knew the truth about your own family, and staying silent meant money, stability, and peace, would you take the deal? Or would the weight of that silence eventually crush you? Because silence has a shelf life. And when it expires, it doesn't fade quietly. It explodes. What makes this moment different is not just what's being said. It's who is saying it. And the fact that their stories, for the first time, begin to overlap in ways that can't be ignored. But before we get to what Doria now admits about being paid to stay quiet, you need to understand how that silence began in the first place, and the deal that set everything in motion. The deal that changed everything. Imagine being told that the safest thing you can do for your own child is to disappear. Not emotionally, not physically, but verbally. That's the claim at the center of what Doria Ragland now says happened years ago, behind closed doors, far away from cameras and carefully worded press releases. A moment when silence stopped being passive and became formal, deliberate, negotiated. According to what's now being whispered, this wasn't a dramatic argument or a tearful goodbye. It was calm, almost businesslike. The kind of conversation that feels unsettling precisely because no one raises their voice. A conversation that allegedly ended with an agreement. Think about how strange that is. Families fight. Families fall out. But families don't usually draw invisible lines around what can never be spoken again, unless there's something powerful enough on the other side of that line. This is where the story starts to feel less like family drama and more like strategy. Doria has long been described as the quiet constant. The one who didn't give interviews. The one who didn't lash out. The one who never contradicted the official narrative. For years, that restraint was praised as grace, as wisdom, as proof that she was above the noise. But what if it wasn't restraint at all? What if silence wasn't a personality trait, but a condition? According to the emerging claims, the agreement wasn't just about keeping peace. It wasn't about avoiding embarrassment. It was about control. About making sure certain chapters of the past stayed closed, even as new ones were being written very publicly. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The silence allegedly wasn't open-ended. It came with expectations, boundaries, topics that could never be addressed, questions that could never be answered, not even indirectly. Ask yourself this. If there was nothing to hide, why define what can't be said? The most chilling part isn't even the money. It's the implication that silence itself had value, that a voice, especially a mother's voice, was considered powerful enough to require containment. And while Doria stayed quiet, others didn't get that option. Thomas Markle spoke and was ridiculed. Samantha Markle spoke and was dismissed. Their words were framed as chaos, as bitterness, as desperation. But now, with this alleged agreement in the background, their noise takes on a different meaning. What if they weren't reckless, but excluded? What if the real order was silence, and everyone else was simply breaking it without permission? And here's the detail that shifts everything. According to those familiar with the situation, the agreement wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to hold until a certain point, until a certain stability was achieved, until the story no longer needed protection. Which raises one terrifying question. If the silence had an expiration date, what happened when it passed? Because according to Doria, the first rule of the agreement was the one she finally broke. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. What Doria says she wasn't allowed to say. Have you ever stopped yourself mid-sentence because you suddenly remembered you're not allowed to finish it? That's the image people close to Doria describe. Moments where a thought surfaced, a memory hovered just behind her eyes, and then vanished. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't permitted. According to what Doria now admits, the agreement didn't just ask for silence. It defined it, carefully, almost surgically. It wasn't a vague, don't talk to the press, understanding. It was specific. Certain subjects were off limits entirely. Certain years were never to be revisited. Certain names were never to be spoken out loud, even in passing. And that's where this stops being about privacy and starts being about erasure. Think about it. Silence is one thing, but selective silence? That's storytelling by omission. Doria's public calm suddenly looks different when you consider what she claims she couldn't clarify, couldn't correct, couldn't defend. When narratives formed that painted other family members as unstable, unreliable, or malicious, she stayed quiet. When timelines were questioned, she stayed quiet. When contradictions appeared between public statements and private history, she stayed quiet. Not because she agreed. Because she couldn't intervene. Here's the part that hits hardest. According to those close to her, Doria didn't just stay silent in public. She stayed silent in private too. Friends noticed it. Conversations would drift toward the past, then stop abruptly. There were stories she would start, and then abandon halfway through with a change of subject and a distant look. Ask yourself this. How heavy does a truth have to be before it becomes dangerous to carry? What makes this even more unsettling is that Doria now suggests the agreement wasn't only about protecting one person. It was about maintaining consistency, making sure that nothing emerged that could fracture the image once it was fully established. That means the silence wasn't defensive. It was preventative. And prevention implies foresight, which raises an uncomfortable contradiction. If no scandal existed, why anticipate one? Why prepare silence in advance? Doria reportedly struggled most when the public narrative began drifting further and further away from reality. Not in small ways, in fundamental ones. The kind that rewrite motivations. The kind that recast past relationships and reframe intentions. And yet, she said nothing. Until now. What finally pushed her to break that silence wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was exhaustion. The emotional fatigue of watching others be torn apart while she sat on information that could change the entire conversation. But here's the detail that sends chills down the spine. Doria wasn't the only one who knew about the agreement. Others were aware. Others understood the boundaries. Others benefited from her silence. Which means this wasn't a private arrangement between two people. It was a system. And once you see it that way, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If Doria was paid not to speak, who else was warned to stay in line? Because the moment that silence cracked, it didn't just expose her story. It exposed everyone who depended on it. And that's when Thomas Markle realized something that would change everything. Thomas Markle, the silence he refused to keep. What do you do when you realize the truth is being protected and you were never invited into the agreement? That's the question Thomas Markle says he's been living with for years. According to those close to him, the moment Thomas began to understand that Doria's silence wasn't just personal choice, something shifted. Suddenly, the imbalance made sense. One parent vanished from the conversation entirely, while the other was left speaking into a storm alone. One was praised for dignity. The other was mocked for desperation. And that contrast didn't happen by accident. Thomas has always maintained that he wasn't trying to destroy anyone. He says he was trying to correct the record, to respond to claims that felt incomplete, selective, or flat-out misleading. But without context, his voice sounded chaotic, defensive, even self-serving. Now ask yourself this. How would anyone sound if they were arguing against a story no one else was allowed to challenge? Here's where the emotional weight deepens. Thomas reportedly learned about the existence of a silence agreement indirectly, not through a conversation, not through honesty, but through absence, through the realization that certain topics were never acknowledged by the one person who could confirm or deny them. Imagine that, knowing someone close to the truth, watching them stay silent, and realizing that silence might not be voluntary. Thomas's frustration, according to people around him, wasn't just about being ignored. It was about being replaced, about watching his role in the story shrink while another narrative expanded smoothly, uninterrupted. And the irony is brutal. The louder he spoke, the less credible he appeared. The quieter Doria remained, the more composed she seemed. Silence, in this case, wasn't just golden. It was strategic. Thomas has said that what hurt most wasn't being portrayed negatively. It was being portrayed alone, as if he were the only one who remembered certain moments, certain timelines, certain details that didn't align with what the public was told. Here's the contradiction that keeps resurfacing. If Thomas was truly unreliable, why was his voice the only one being challenged so aggressively? Why wasn't there balance? Why wasn't there correction? Unless correction was never allowed. According to Thomas, the silence protected more than one image. It protected a structure, a version of events that required one parent to disappear completely while the other absorbed all the fallout. And this is where his refusal to stay quiet takes on a different meaning. Maybe it wasn't recklessness. Maybe it was resistance. Because Thomas claims there was one truth he was never supposed to say out loud. Not because it was scandalous, but because it would reveal how much effort had gone into controlling the narrative itself. And once you see the effort, you can't unsee it. But Thomas wasn't the only one watching this happen in real time. Someone else was taking notes. Someone else was being warned. Someone else was learning exactly what happens when you speak without permission. And her name changes everything. Samantha Markle and the cost of speaking. What if the real lesson wasn't what happened when you stayed silent, but what happened when you didn't? Samantha Markle learned that lesson the hard way. While one parent disappeared into quiet restraint and the other became the public lightning rod, Samantha was watching something else unfold. A pattern. Speak, and you're punished. Stay quiet, and you're protected. Fall in line, and the story moves on without you. From Samantha's perspective, the message was never subtle. She has said that from the moment she refused to disappear, the tone around her changed. Conversations stopped. Doors closed. Invitations vanished. Suddenly, her voice wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Ask yourself this. Why is silence always described as grace, but speaking is framed as bitterness? Samantha insists she wasn't trying to tear anything down. She says she was responding, reacting, defending herself against a narrative that painted her as cruel, opportunistic, and irrelevant. And yet, every time she spoke, the backlash intensified. Meanwhile, silence was being rewarded elsewhere. Here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If Samantha's words were truly meaningless, why did they provoke such strong reactions? Why did they need to be discredited so aggressively? Why did her credibility matter so much if she was supposedly inconsequential? According to Samantha, the answer is simple. She wasn't dangerous because she was loud. She was dangerous because she wasn't controlled. She has suggested that she became aware, over time, that there were boundaries she wasn't meant to cross. Topics that caused visible discomfort. Questions that were never answered directly. Moments where she was advised, subtly but firmly, to stop talking. Not legally, not formally, but clearly. And here's the part that reframes everything. Samantha claims she realized something crucial while watching Doria remain silent year after year. Silence wasn't neutral. It was currency, and she didn't have any. While one person's quiet was interpreted as dignity, Samantha's refusal to stay quiet was framed as instability. That contrast wasn't accidental. It shaped public perception. It decided who was believable before anyone even listened. Let me ask you something. If telling the truth costs you everything, but staying silent costs you nothing, What does that say about the system you're speaking into? Samantha has said that at one point, she understood exactly what was happening. The silence wasn't just protecting a person. It was protecting a version of the past. And anyone who threatened that version had to be neutralized, either by exclusion or ridicule. And then came the moment that changed everything. According to Samantha, she was warned. Not outright. Not with threats. But with implication. A suggestion that continuing to speak would only make things worse. That the consequences were already set in motion. And that's when she realized the silence wasn't just expected. It was enforced. Because once silence becomes the price of peace, the truth becomes a liability. And that realization is what finally pushed all three stories into the same collision course. Because the moment Doria's silence cracked, Thomas's persistence made sense. And Samantha's punishment suddenly had a context. But what happens next isn't just about family anymore. It's about what happens when a carefully controlled narrative starts to unravel, and the people who built it realize they're losing control. When silence finally breaks. So here we are. After years of noise, years of denial, years of carefully curated distance, the pattern finally comes into focus. Not because one person spoke, but because three voices, long out of sync, suddenly aligned. Think back to the question we started with. What if the loudest truth was never spoken because someone was paid to make sure it stayed buried? Now ask yourself this instead. How many decisions had to be made for that silence to hold as long as it did? A mother choosing restraint that looked like grace. A father choosing volume that looked like chaos. A sister choosing persistence that looked like obsession. Three different responses to the same invisible boundary. Three different prices paid. When you line them up, the story stops looking random. It starts looking engineered. Doria's silence now reads less like detachment and more like containment. Thomas's outbursts look less like recklessness and more like resistance. Samantha's persistence looks less like bitterness and more like refusal. The roles never changed. Only the framing did. And framing is everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of it all. Silence didn't protect this family. It delayed the fallout. It allowed contradictions to stack up. It let resentment ferment. It created a vacuum where speculation thrived because clarity was never allowed.